Howdy, my name is Kyle Brim and I am part of Team Neutrogena, and we have used machine learning techniques to develop a skin lesion classifier. Going over the background of this project, the disease that we're focusing on is skin cancer, specifically melanoma. And skin cancer affects 1 in 5 Americans by the age of 70, with melanomas being the most dangerous as they are aggressive and at risk of metastasizing. Additionally, their case numbers are on the rise, and we expect that in 2021, more than 10,000 Americans are going to perish from melanoma. The data used in this study originally was published by Harvard in the Human Against Machine 10,000 dermatoscope image dataset. It had 7 classes representing 7 different types of skin lesions. However, a physician modified the dataset, simplified it to be a binary classifier between melanoma versus not melanoma images, augmented the classes a little bit, and then uploaded it to Kaggle, which is where I got my data from. Right now, the current healthcare workflow is for someone who has a suspicious lesion or mole arise in their body, they'll go see their primary care physician. If it makes their PCP nervous, they'll then be referenced to a dermatologist, who then, if they think it's a melanoma, will recommend a biopsy. The biopsy will be read by a pathologist, and then the patient finally gets their diagnosis. Our goal as Neutrogena is to fit into that middle section where the dermatologists currently sit. The reason for this is that dermatologist wait times are above 30 days and continuing to rise. This can be troublesome as melanomas are aggressive, and although they have a wonderful 99% 5-year survival rate if caught early on, as soon as it metastasizes and reaches distant tissues, that 5-year survival rate drops down to a dismal 27%. Time is of the essence here, and that 30-day wait time is something we would like to avoid. And of course, the more money that we can save physicians and their patients in the healthcare industry, the better off everyone is going to be. Going over our data quickly, the data was presented in a training, validation, and testing set. I merged the validation and training set together to create 14,000 images representing the melanoma and not melanoma classes. The classes were completely balanced, so that represents around 7,120 of each the melanoma and not melanoma classes. And then the testing data set was split 50-50 as well. The origin of the data, so the ISIC data is the original HAM10K data set representing 10,000 images. In order to balance the classes better, as the physician who uploaded it to Kaggle did, he augmented the melanoma classes through horizontal flips, vertical flips, zooming, etc., to create an even number of images. So around 7,750 of the images in the data set were augmented rather than originals. The pre-processing and the baseline. The images were normalized before they were uploaded to Kaggle, so I didn't have to do any of that. However, the images were sent to me in 2 different sizes. The augmented images were 224 by 224 pixels, whereas the HAM10K images were 450 by 600 pixels. So I had to resize them all to the same size because that's what the models are going to train better on. Additionally, I did a train generator with a little bit of data augmentations, including horizontal flips, vertical flips, and slight zooming, but I didn't go too in depth with it as I didn't want to interfere with what the model should be training on, as I was not completely familiar with what defined a melanoma versus a not melanoma. And furthermore, I didn't want to inadvertently create an image already in the data set since so many of my images had already been augmented. Finally, a baseline completely random classifier would be 50% accurate since I have 2 classes and they are evenly balanced. Going over my preliminary model, this is the simplest model that I could create that was essentially an iteration between 2D convolutions and max pooling before it was flattened into 2 dense layers. The first dense layer had 512 neurons, and the final one was a single neuron activated by sigmoid, which is common for binary classifiers. I expected that a model this simple would give me a baseline understanding of what is better than completely random, but still not the best model you could create. My final model was an ensemble of 2 main models, the Xception and the Inception ResNet v2 architectures prepackaged in Keras. They're both Inception networks, and essentially what that means is that they have a bunch of convolutional neural networks running in parallel before they finally meet at the end. Ensembling them together, I relied upon both. And the combination step essentially worked that if the Xception network was mildly confident that an image was a melanoma, but the inception ResNet v2 was very confident it was not melanoma. The linear sum would err on the side of the inception ResNet v2, and the ensemble would predict the image as not melanoma. Going over our results quickly, as you can see, my baseline or simplest model achieved an 83% accuracy with an area under the receiver operating characteristic curve of 0.924. This is important because there was a paper published in Nature in early 2017 that had 21 board certified dermatologists look at these same images, and they achieved an AUC generally above 0.7 but below 0.9. So all of my models are actually outperforming 21 board certified physicians, especially the ResNet v2 model, which had an AUC of 0.985, the best of all models tested. My ensemble network had the highest accuracy and recall and the highest F1 score. Notably, the exception had the fewest false negatives of any of the models. Moving into the discussion, on the right, I have a confusion matrix for the ensemble model. The not melanoma class was classified with a very high accuracy at 98%, but the ensemble struggled a little bit more with the melanoma class, getting it correct only 91% of the time. This can be challenging because in the clinical setting, a false positive is a biopsy a patient didn't need, but a false negative is a cancer that is going untreated and unnoticed. And because the exception had the fewest false negatives, fewer than my ensemble and inception ResNet v2, it may in fact be the more clinically ready model because false negatives have a much higher consequence than false positives. On the left side, I have a joint plot that shows on the x-axis the prediction for each image by the ensemble model, and on the y-axis, the baseline. Essentially what it does is it gave each image a score between 0 and 1. The closer the image was to 0.5, the less confident the image was about its classification. The closer to 0, it was very confident it was not melanoma, and the closer to 1, the model was very confident it was melanoma. As you can see, the ensemble model was very confident about melanoma images, knowing when it saw one, it knew it was melanoma, and when it didn't see a melanoma or it saw the not melanoma images, it wasn't as confident. In a clinical setting, this confidence could be important to point out because if a physician sees that the model is not very sure about its prediction, then it might be worth a second look just so you don't have those false negatives and those undiagnosed cancers. Some future directions. A better data set is always going to be useful. We need more images. Most of the ones published in papers had northward of 100,000 training images, whereas I had only 14,000. More ethnicities and races need to be represented. This data set was almost entirely Caucasians, and although they do make up the majority of melanoma diagnoses, it's not representative of the clinical setting. A larger ensemble would be a good thing to do in the future as well with 4+ networks. I only had 2 networks and they were both inception networks. In other words, my ensemble was not very diverse, including dense nets or skip nets where they essentially have shortcuts that feed or outputs from early layers into later layers. And then, of course, classical methods like support vector machines and random forest classifiers can create a more diverse and well-differentiated ensemble model that will be able to overcome the challenges that my inception models struggled with. Finally, the clinical setting isn't simply binary of melanoma versus not melanoma. There are many different types of skin lesions, and being able to test these models against the 7-class problem from the HAM10K would give us a better understanding of how they're going to do in the future when there's many different skin lesions that they're looking at. These are the sources that I used for my presentation. Thank you very much.